If you have not heard, so just recently, Aaron Maté actually spoke at the United Nations in reference to the OPCW report. Now, what we are going to do is I'm going to try to summarize this as simply as I can. I'm going to try to do the best that I can here because obviously Aaron can explain this a lot better than I can. But I feel like this is an important story and we need to talk about this because in a way, because of some of the censorship that's involved with this story, it actually connects to the story after this. So we'll get to that in just a second. But the OPCW, so that stands for Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I'm looking at my notes here. I never do notes for the show, but for this time I had to. For this story, I had to. Okay. So it stands for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Now, to make a long story short, basically, during the civil war in Syria, there was an OPCW report. The problem with that report was that it omitted key information from some of the inspectors that were involved during the civil war in Syria, particularly in Douma. There was leaked information. One of the things that was leaked was the fact that apparently the symptoms that the citizens of Douma were experiencing did not match typical symptoms of chlorine exposure. The second concern was that the gas attacks were apparently staged. Now that's coming from Professor Postal from MIT. Why is this important? Because it weakens the need for the attacks from the United States government. Now, some people still won't cover this story. Some people still won't report on this. Aaron Maté has already won awards for reporting this story. And you may remember a while back, now this was 2019, the Gray Zone did release this. Leaked OPCW report suggests Syria gas attack was staged. And that was coming from the MIT scientist, Professor Postal, that I just told you about. I want to go back. I think it's very important that we walk through the timeline, especially for those of you who may not be as familiar, right? It has been, 5 years now? It's been 5 years now. So let's go back and let's look at part of this interview that Aaron had with Professor Postal about the information that was leaked about the gas attack being staged. Here we go.
The U.S. has issued a new threat to Syria over what it calls the Syrian military's possible use of chemical weapons in the province of Idlib. But this warning comes as a previous allegation that led to U.S. military strikes on Syria is coming under question. The Syrian government was accused of dropping gas cylinders that killed dozens in the city of Douma in April 2018. But a newly leaked engineering assessment from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons challenges that claim and says there is a higher probability that the cylinders were, quote, manually placed.
So you see this piece right here? Manually placed. In other words, staged. This reminds me of something similar, although not as extreme, but it reminds me of something similar that happened during the George Floyd protests in Fayetteville, North Carolina. The night before the protests, there were bricks. All of a sudden, these bricks that just appeared out of nowhere piled up in front of the stores in downtown Fayetteville. They were not there before. There was no construction being done. And a friend of mine who does local journalism there, she actually had taken pictures of that and had reported on that and was like, where do these bricks come from all of a sudden? Just in time for the protest. It was almost as though they were giving the protesters something to use. Here's these bricks. Why don't you pick one up and throw it? Something like that. That's what this kind of reminded me of, the fact that it was just manually placed there.
This is the first time this judgment has been made public. It was excluded from the OPCW's final report on the Douma incident, which was used to pin the blame on the Syrian government. Theodore Postal is professor of science, technology, and national security policy at MIT, and he joins me now. Welcome, Professor Postal. If you could first talk about just what this leaked document says and what you think the significance of it is.
So, Professor Postal, by the way, for those who are not aware, I worked at MIT. So some of these people that come up, I kind of know off the top of my head some of the things that they've done. He also worked for the Pentagon. Like back in the, like before he worked at MIT, he worked for the Pentagon, and he also criticized the Iron Dome. I don't know if everyone's aware of that, but he was one of those people that was heavily attacked because he had criticisms of Israel's Iron Dome. So he was a little bit of a, he was a little rogue.
This document is a highly professional document that was obviously produced by a team of experts. It's written in an extremely careful way, and in fact, it describes something that that with high probability. But I would say, if I were advising somebody, as I did when I was in the Pentagon, I advised the Chief of Naval Operations, and part of my job was to take, technically detailed analyses and translate it into information that could be readily understood by an intelligent non-expert. So if I were briefing the chief on this particular document, I would not caveat it quite the way that the professionals did, although they did a good job. I would simply say that the evidence is overwhelming that the gas attacks were staged. And then I would explain why this evidence is overwhelming. And the reason the evidence is overwhelming is they did, first of all, very careful mathematical calculations to determine what the scene should look like if it occurred as it appeared. So, for example, they, using a computer, assumed that a cylinder filled with chlorine was dropped from 500 meters onto this roof.
Okay, now that piece right there is important, the cylinder filled with chlorine, because at the beginning, remember I explained to you, one of the information that was leaked was the fact that when they actually observed the symptoms of the people in Duma, what they found, medical professionals, what they found is that their symptoms were not symptoms of people who had chlorine exposure. So that's just important to remember.
The roofs. And what they found is that the cylinder always went through the roof. So that's a very interesting result. In fact, what they did is, because these are computer experiments, that is to say mathematical calculations that are done where they can change the parameters, they actually mathematically dropped cylinders that had nothing in them, because they could not get a situation where a cylinder hit the surface of this reinforced concrete roof and did not just go right through it. And this is critical because what the calculation indicates is that the cylinder would have had so much momentum that it would have gone through the roof. It would not have been on the roof, just sticking in through this hole that it appeared to be the situation when inspected. They then took their observations. They had experts on the scene, and these are real experts. I want to underscore real experts versus phony experts. I'll have more to say about that shortly. And these real experts observed that the hole in the roof had all the characteristics of a hole created by either an artillery rocket or a mortar shell. And these holes of this kind have certain characteristics that an expert, a true expert, a real expert would understand. So, and they describe those details so that someone like me can understand why their conclusion is that it was an explosive charge that created the hole. That is to say, somebody was firing rockets and mortars. Some of them landed on the roof of this. One of them landed on the roof of this building. It produced a hole, and somebody else came along, hauled the cylinder to this location and stuck it through the hole and tried to make it look like there was a scene that was created where the cylinder fell, caused the hole, and then happened to be sticking through the hole.
So what he's basically saying is that the cylinder, based on the physics and based on based on the physics and based on the math, it appears that the cylinder was put there after the fact, that it didn't actually cause the hole. Say whatever you want, but math doesn't lie. Okay? Like math, numbers, like no, this doesn't lie. So basically, it's like they were saying that the hole was caused by the cylinders when, based on the math and the physics, that couldn't possibly be true. The hole was caused by a rocket, so to speak. And then the cylinders were placed there after the fact to make it look like that is what caused it. Let's go on a little bit more here, and then I want to get to that speech.
Well, it turns out when you do the mathematical calculation, that's not what would occur. The cylinder would just pass through the roof. Now, if you read this report as an experienced person like myself, who is can claim some expertise as a professional, you would find a very interesting sentence early in the report. In the early part of the report, they describe how they collected data, and they describe collecting data by their own observations, by interviewing various people, and by having discussions with what they describe as supposed experts.
Let me read that quote, Professor Postal. The situation was also complicated by the many sources of information and opinion about what was alleged to have occurred, including impressions and views of alleged witnesses, spokespersons, the media, representatives of state parties, as well as the views of supposed experts in subsequent exchanges.
Yes. Now,
notice it says supposed experts.
if I were writing a report, or if any other serious professional were writing a report, and there was legitimate disagreement among real experts, people who you don't dismiss as not knowing what they're doing, you would describe them as experts who have different judgments about this or that, and you would describe what those judgments are, because you want to give people an understanding of what the legitimate possible alternative explanations might be. Instead, these people just talk about supposed experts. That is a signal to any other person who's a real expert that they're saying, we had to deal with a lot of nonsense. And now, if you also include the fact that this is a document that is written within a highly constrained bureaucratic environment, that's another indication that the choice of these words is a serious criticism of the environment they're in. If you were in the Pentagon and you were in an environment where you were allowed to do your work freely, you would never refer to other people who had other input as supposed experts. And I think this is a very telltale statement. Now, on top of this, you have a report that was produced and provided to the UN Security Council. And this report is itself very interesting.
So this is the OPCW report that he's referring to.
The report describes exactly what is described as the methodology used in this paper. They talk, in other words, this is a report to the UN Security Council that's published. And they talk about using computer simulations to understand how the scene was produced. And so they give the same description of how they went about doing the analysis, but they say that the result was the scenes that they looked at and the scenes that they produced through mathematical simulation agreed. So they come to a totally different statement from the statement in this leaked document.
Right. And so I already explained to you guys that math doesn't lie, right? But they lied in that report. So they left that information out what he was saying about where the cylinders were placed after the fact. And then I want to get to the speech that Aaron had. So Aaron was at the UN recently. If you're signed up for his Substack, you'll see this. I'm not going to read the entire thing. I just want to read this piece right here, and then we'll get to the video. It says, oh, it's so tiny. On Friday, March 24th, I spoke to the United Nations Security Council about the OPCW's ongoing cover-up of its investigation into the alleged April 2018 chemical attack in Douma, Syria. At the center of the scandal are two veteran OPCW scientists who deployed to Syria in April 2018 for the OPCW's Douma probe. The pair have accused senior OPCW officials of manipulating the investigation to reach a conclusion that basely impacted the Syrian government in a chlorine gas attack. Their concerns are backed up by a trove of leaked documents, which I have extensively reported on. So that's a little bit of a intro there. And then now we're going to go to the opening speech at the UN. And again, I want to say this is not the first time that he has spoken to the United Nations about this particular issue. He has done this multiple times. I think this is the third time. So, and nothing has been done. So let's go on.
This is now the third time that I've had the opportunity to
Eric, we will need volume booster for this one, if I remember correctly.
Address members of the Security Council about the controversy surrounding the OPCW's investigation of the alleged chemical attack in Douma. And if I can share one opinion, while I really appreciate this opportunity, I have to say that I find it unfortunate that nearly 5 years after that alleged incident in Douma, this controversy around the OPCW investigation is still being debated in public rather than being addressed by the OPCW. Because fundamentally, this is a controversy that is internal to the OPCW. And at the heart of it are at least two veteran inspectors from the OPCW with nearly 30 years of combined experience who worked on the Douma investigation, who deployed to Syria for the Douma investigation. And what they say is very simple. They have accused senior officials at the OPCW of suppressing findings from their probe and putting out unsupported conclusions that baselessly implicate the Syrian government in a chemical attack. And they are not demanding that their own opinions be affirmed as the ultimate truth. They just want the right to be heard. And rather than hearing these inspectors, allowing them to come in and voice their concerns, allowing the OPCW to weigh the findings that were suppressed, the OPCW has refused to meet with them, and he's even denigrated them in public, which I...
So here's the question I have. If they don't believe that there is a different narrative that they should explore here, why not just meet with the inspectors? You know, like they're not meeting with those inspectors on purpose because they know that there's truth to what they're saying and they don't want to hear it. Then they may have to record it and then they may have to edit that report.
I will get into. So when I talk about the suppression of the Douma probe, it's a long story which I've gone through before, so I won't repeat the whole story. But let me just to illustrate, give you one example of the documented suppression of the findings of the Douma probe, which nobody contests. This is uncontested fact. So the alleged chemical attack happens on April 7th, 2018. Afterwards, OPCW investigators get on the ground. The first time, by the way, that an OPCW fact-finding mission manages to reach the site of an alleged chemical attack in Syria. After they return to The Hague, and now this account that I'm telling you is based on both public documents and also leaked documents that have come out. So after the Douma team gets back to The Hague, they do chemical analysis, and they discover something very strange. The symptoms of the Douma victims, the people seen in the photographs, they look like they've been subjected to a nerve agent attack. There is profuse foaming from the mouth in several victims. And inside the apartment building where dozens of bodies were filmed, The victims are gathered in piles at the center of a room. So these are classic signs of a nerve agent attack like sarin. But the OPCW's chemical analysis that comes from its own labs turns up no traces of any nerve agents whatsoever, including sarin.
In other words, a chlorine attack is most likely probably not going to make you foam at the mouth. Like, I don't know if you guys remember do you guys remember seeing this on the news? I remember seeing these videos and these images at the time that this had happened. Really disturbing images at that point in time, I think. But I think the thing is like, from what Aaron's saying, it's sounding like the people of Duma, they just want it to be corrected. They just want the record to be corrected. They're just asking for some type of accountability here. It doesn't seem like they're even asking for some of the things I think they should be asking for. I think they should be asking for more, but it doesn't seem like, they are, but they need to correct the record.
So the OPCW team has a quandary. You have symptoms of a nerve agent attack, but no evidence of nerve agents in the chemical samples. So they need expertise. So what do? They fly to Germany to consult with top military toxicologists for help. And they show these German toxicologists, 4 of them, photos and videos of the incident in Duma. The Germans very quickly reach an unequivocal conclusion. They conclude that the observed symptoms of the Duma victims have no correlation to chlorine whatsoever. And one member of the Duma team, who is present at this meeting, writes in an email subsequently that was leaked. And this member is not one of the dissenting inspectors that we know about. This member is the head of the OPCW laboratory, who is not one of the dissenting inspectors that are publicly known. And this head of the OPCW laboratory even reports that one of the Germans raised, quote, the possibility of a staged attack, unquote, in Duma, because, quote, the circumstances of death for the victims do not match chlorine. So that is one of the members of the OPCW, not one of the dissenting inspectors, reporting back that one of these German experts who they consulted pointed out that this could be a staged attack on the grounds that the symptoms of the victims do not match chlorine. So the OPCW team puts this into its report. They write up an original report in June 2018, including all their findings, including the assessment of the German toxicologists that the circumstances of the deaths and the symptoms displayed in the victims do not match chlorine exposure.
Okay, so that piece right there is very key. The toxicology report. You might hear about this sometimes when there's like the death of a celebrity, like when Michael Jackson died, they talked about this. They talked about this when Prince, or the artist formerly known as whatever you're calling him these days, when Prince passed away as well. If there's any type of, chemical substance, drugs, etc., the toxicology report should be able to tell you what was in their system. So if those toxicology reports came back with that information, and then you also have the other inspectors that said that this was a staged attack based on the physics and the math, then why haven't they edited that report? Why haven't they changed that report? Who are they covering up for? Who are they trying to protect? These are the questions we all should be asking ourselves.
What happens to that finding? It gets erased. The OPCW, some unknown senior officials at the OPCW, take the original report produced by the Duma team. They erase that finding based on the German toxicologist input, and they add a series of unsupported conclusions suggesting that a chemical attack occurred. And when this is discovered by the dissenting inspector known as Inspector B, his name is Dr. Brendan Whelan, who is the chief author of that original report, he protests this deception. And that doctored version of the report is withdrawn. But the Germans' input that was censored is never, ever disclosed publicly. In the final report of the Duma investigation put out in March 2019, the Germans' input is still missing. Now, that final report put out in March 2019, it does say that after the Germans were consulted in June 2018, the OPCW went back and heard from 5 more toxicologists to get their input. But they don't tell us what these 5 toxicologists said. All they say, based on the input of these additional toxicologists, is that it is not currently possible to precisely link the cause of the signs and symptoms to a specific chemical, unquote. Now, this ambiguous language obscures the fact that the German toxicologists who were initially consulted had unequivocally ruled out the specific chemical of chlorine gas. But this FFM report doesn't mention the German toxicologist assessment, and in fact, it even erases the fact that these German toxicologists were consulted. So there's a detailed timeline of the Duma mission included in that March 2019 report, showing all the steps that the OPCW investigation in Duma took. And oddly, that German mission is excluded. It no longer exists. So the dissenting inspectors have been trying, first internally, to get the OPCW leadership to address this obvious suppression.
Yeah, so this is it was obviously a sham report, and the fact that there hasn't been some type of order or pressure from the UN or whoever needs to push to get this corrected, that's suspect to me. To me, it says they're trying to hide. They're trying to hide that information. I want to fast forward to, let me finish playing this part, and then I have to fast forward to 20 minutes. There's another part.
To get the OPCW to hear their concerns and weigh the evidence that was suppressed. What has the OPCW done in response? They've refused to allow these inspectors to come in. They've refused their calls to meet with all the original members of the Duma team, not just the dissenting inspectors. And when other officials, including OPCW veterans, have tried to raise these issues publicly, they've been blocked.
Yeah. So basically, they're only wanting to listen to the approved voices. Now, I want to fast forward here when he starts to talk about, yeah, I think it's at the 20 mark, right about, let's make sure I'm not, yeah, this part right here. When he talks about the exposure.
That the incident, quote, is pretty much consistent with a nerve agent type exposure. And as I said earlier, weeks later, when the OPCW consulted these experts in Germany, they went even further and ruled out chlorine exposure.
Yep. So
now we get the IIT's response to all this, their attempt to offer a counter narrative.
So for the other inspectors that provided the other toxicology report where they said they could not determine what the chemical was, that's fine. But at the same time, they could rule out what it was not. And I think that that's the issue that Aaron is mentioning there. Whereas you had the other toxicology report that blatantly said, like, they can rule out, you know, a chlorine here. But then you had the second toxicology report that said, well, we can't really determine what the chemical is. But you can determine what is not. Does that make sense to you guys? So they weren't even trying to do that. Let's go on more here about the exposure.
They claim to have brought in a, quote, independent expert toxicologist who was not involved in previous assessments of the incident, unquote. Well, first of all, this raises an obvious question. Why not consult the toxicologists involved in previous assessments of the incident? After all, the IIT's mandate is based on the findings of the fact-finding mission. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the fact-finding mission heard from German toxicologists that chlorine is not consistent with the symptoms of the Duma victims. The fact-finding mission also heard from 5 new replacement toxicologists, and we don't know what they said because the OPCW never told us, but why not consult with them? And no explanation is given for why we should take the word of this new toxicologist and supposedly independent toxicologist over all the other toxicologists consulted before. That is left unaddressed. This new toxicologist does rule that, in their opinion, the symptoms of the victims are consistent with chlorine gas. But no evidence is presented that could address the key issues raised by the German toxicologist, which is the inconsistency of the symptoms of the Duma victims with chlorine gas, including the profuse foaming at the mouth. There's no effort to address that. In fact, if you read the IIT report, nowhere does the toxicologist say that the profuse foaming at the mouth, which was raised by the German toxicologist as a very key issue, there's no evidence that this new IIT toxicologist has even addressed that. And nowhere does this toxicologist say that those symptoms, specifically profuse foaming at the mouth, are consistent with chlorine gas.
Okay, so that's important as well. They addressed that again with the symptoms that people were experiencing and the chemicals that they were, supposedly exposed to. So that's important for people to know. If you want to see the full video, you can catch that on Gray Zone. It's Aaron Maté at UN OPCW covers up, denies justice to Duma victims. And also, if you're not familiar with this story, I highly recommend that you start with this article, which I featured earlier. This article here, leaked OPCW report suggests Syria gas attack was staged, MIT scientist says. So this article was released May 25th, 2019. So I recommend that you start there, because I don't want you to, if you start with the speech at the UN and you're not familiar with the story, you might be a little bit confused and you might start asking yourself questions like, who are these people that he's referring to, right? But third time at the United Nations. Same story. So they have not made adjustments there. Child of God said it is important to remember that people were murdered to stage this event. There's that too. Lorshek, the report had to be modified to serve its U.S. purpose. Desert Mantis says the big question is who murdered these people?